Welcome to Cultural Fluency Makers. I'm your host, David Wellisch. Each week, we welcome leaders to share how they stay ahead of the ever-changing consumer landscape. With today's cultural transformation, top brands need to understand diverse consumer segments from Gen Z, Hispanic, and LGBTQ+, to gamers, wine enthusiasts, and basketball fanatics in Iowa. Their marketing strategies require them to keep the pulse on their consumers, but also their brand in the category to continue to grow revenue for the long term. Cultural Fluency Makers is sponsored by Collage Group, the only cultural intelligence engine that provides brand and consumer insights on the why that drives consumer behavior and purchase decisions. Let's get started. I have been very much looking forward to this episode, as I know that it'll be very dynamic and insightful. With me today is a global data and AI leader who has driven transformation across some of the world's most recognized organizations. He is an award-winning analytics executive, recognized among the top 100 most influential data leaders by Data IQ for 2 consecutive years, and known for driving the adoption of AI, intelligent automation, and turning data into strategic business decisions, so important these days. Over the course of his career, he has built and scaled enterprise analytics capability at companies like Procter Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and Mondelez, helping turn data into real business impact. Beyond the enterprise, he's also a sought-after speaker and educator, sharing his expertise on industry stages and in the classroom at Rutgers Business School. Today with me is the VP and Head of Data, Analytics, and Strategy at the Edgewell Personal Care, Pankaj Chopra. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's do this. Let's just start going deep. Pankaj, as you well know, given your roles in so many great enterprises, this country has gone through a demographic landscape shift in the last, 10, 15, 20 years. It's a long time coming. Given all that, and given the shifts in the complexity of the consumer and the generational shifts, what do you see the role for cultural intelligence or cultural insights for consumer companies today?
Great question, David. So I think if we go back 15, 20 years as marketeers or analytics professionals or data professionals, the whole consumer landscape and marketing landscape was very linear, right? You have had a generally homogeneous consumer. Of course, we did the segmentation and everything, but generally it was a homogeneous consumer. And we were trying to delight that consumer with certain, I would say, base level kind of one size fits all solutions. Of course, we used to do a lot of improvisations and targeting, but in general, the consumer was very homogeneous. What we started seeing is that over a period of time, a lot of strategies, both product development, communication, weren't really resonating with our consumer. And we realized that the single consumer which we had in mind, for example, if you are looking at beauty, anti-aging beauty, your mind is, hey, somebody who's in their mid-30s or mid-40s looking for anti-aging solutions, that got totally dissipated. Because now we're talking of consumers who are coming from different cultural contexts. It could be a context where skincare is the key driver for my life versus skincare is an important driver. And this is one example. So what we found that going forward, the whole fabric of consumer needs started becoming very diverse. So different consumers through their cultural context were wanting different benefits from the same category. And I can, talk about beauty as one example, and we can talk about other categories as well. In beauty, for example, if you were 20 years ago, it was all about the beauty standard was very consistent. And the benefits which we needed to derive from a beauty products were also very consistent. Young skin, acne, anti-aging. But now we found that even in anti-aging, there's a set of consumers who's asking for plain anti-aging for a normal or a dry skin, whereas there's another consumer who wants anti-aging benefits to enhance their already excellent skin, which is oily. And the whole product proposition, communication, repeat kind of, had to be segmented. So I think that's a big shift. And that's getting, I think, more and more complex because this is all around the cultural context. But you also have a cultural context by generation. So when we talk about Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, the difference between the new generation and the previous generation is much larger than what we used to see in the past.
That's great. So complexity at the center, preferences, generational shifts, diversity at large, and yet more important than ever to get right. What is hard, Pankaj? What is hard about this?
I think there are a couple of things which are hard. Now, if you are a Fortune 50 company, you've lived your way in a certain way. So the first thing which is very hard is to really accept and even observe and acknowledge that the landscape has changed. Because if you've been doing something for the last 20 years, you might kind of be able to make small changes, but it's very hard for people, especially who've grown in the system and are leading these organizations, to go and have a paradigm shift. It's a very different discussion if you're a startup, and we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But for conventional blue chip companies, it becomes very hard. So that's the first thing. The second thing is because of this complexity, the whole, the whole process of looking at simplistically your consumer, talking to your consumers, understanding what they're looking for, coming up with a need gap, and coming up with a recipe as a solution is not simplistic because, as you said, there's so much data and complexity. So a normal human mind cannot process 100 different segments with hundreds of nuances. And that is where the role of data, technology, and AI comes in. So what we find is that, once again, people who've grown through a very traditional CPG environment are unable to become fully data native or AI native. And that becomes a barrier as well. And there are a few other barriers, but I think pretty much there's a barrier of acceptance and change and willingness to change and the energy for change. And there's a barrier to use the new tools, which will actually help you to get those insights in this new era.
So, Pankaj, I've had the privilege of moderating roundtables and having these types of conversations. Obviously, as the founder of Collage, we've served hundreds and hundreds of brands. And it's interesting when I ask the question, so how important is cultural relevance for your brand and to win hearts and minds of consumers? The answer is always, oh my gosh, it's front and center. Great. For you, what is cultural relevance? Like, what is cultural relevance and how does a brand become it?
In some ways, it's very similar. It's an eternal truth, and I'll talk about it. And some ways it's different. So one thing which hasn't changed is the whole philosophy of consumer as boss, right? So our job as CPG marketeers is to serve our consumers, delight them, help them to kind of, fulfill and bridge their need gap. So that hasn't changed. But the relevance of how we access those need gaps and serve our consumer has changed significantly. And that's not, and I'm not talking about, comms, or I'm not talking about, proposition, but I'm talking about the whole product experience, your service around the product, and then how do you kind of retain consumers and bring them back to repurchase your product? I think that has changed a lot. So there are two parts of it, and that's the dichotomy which as marketeers or as insights professionals or as data leaders, we need to be very mindful of.
Fascinating. You have often, Pankaj, described data, and you're doing it now as the lifeblood of an organization. And I could not agree with you more, especially in the world of AI. Um, in the context of cultural relevance, how do you move this barrier, this legacy organization, from seeing data, if anything, as a backward looking report to seeing it as a living pulse of where culture is moving?
I think there's a realization which is happening in companies. So what is happening is that unlike in the past, obviously there are few data, we used to have few data streams, right? Once you launch the product, you'll probably have some structured data coming in. You can speak with consumers. The challenge with the marketers are now facing is that they are, because of a very complex consumer environment and a communication environment, you're getting data from a lot of discrete channels. So you can have, social people talking socially. You can have people reviewing products, which is ratings and reviews. You could have somebody who is talking, who's searching for something, which is very different to what you talk on a social network, right? So you suddenly start seeing that you have multiple sources of data, and all of these sources of data have a different user experience, different, there's no SSO, right? There's a different user experience, that's a different vendor, and they tell a different story.
Mm.
And the challenge sometimes is the stories contradict. So what people talk on Twitter may not be what people search on Google or they search on an LLM. So the challenge now is that with so many multiple data sources, how does a human mind really make sense of it?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the context of data and how do we curate that data becomes very, very different. And that's where, the whole area of machine learning and AI comes in, and we talk about sentiment analysis, topic modeling. But that's a whole new world, which is very, very critical as you kind of talk about these new data sources.
It seems like analytics become center stage, right? Like, meaning you've got as data sources explode, then understanding signal, understanding what's important, what's not important, how to get to the source of truth, all of that is it becomes so critical for an organization.
Exactly. So, I remember 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, I was in a global role. And whenever we wanted to meet consumers, we'll get on a plane. You go to, so for example, if you wanted to kind of launch something in China, you'll get on a plane, spend a day, kill yourself with jet lag, meet 15 consumers, and then you come back and you design something, right? And that was such a simple thing. Now you can definitely go there. There's always merit in meeting consumers. Absolutely. But that itself, meeting 15 consumers will never tell you what the consumer is looking for. And that is why your muscle and capability and ability to manage and leverage data with real human interaction and bring it together in a story, that becomes a critical driver. And that's how the world is changing.
It's great. Um, you have often said that the challenge is not getting more data, but understanding the business context. When you look at diverse segments such as a Gen Z generation or a U.S. Hispanic consumer segment, what is one cultural truth that you found that the data alone couldn't tell you, but the human insight did?
So we were working. This was many years ago. I was still in California at that time, and we were trying to win with the Hispanic consumer. And California is a very highly, I would say, evolved, has a very high evolvement of the Hispanic consumer, right? And we somehow felt we were not winning. And we were looking at beauty, and we said, hey, why don't we talk to Hispanic consumers and offer them the beautiful world of Hispanic beauty care? So there was a lot of work which was done, and we met consumers and we said, hey, you know what? We actually are here to help you and serve you. These are some of your benefits which you need from your products because this is how you were brought up. and culturally you're close to, and I'm not giving details for confidentiality, you're very close to what you're looking for, and we are here to offer you from through our brands. So it was very revealing, and I still remember sitting in that house with that lady, and she said, "Listen, I am very proud of my heritage." And as Hispanics are much more beauty conscious. They over-index on beauty spend. The skin care regimen is much more evolved, and the quality of skin is also much more, I would say, it glows much more, right? So they're very proud of it. But she said, "Listen, I know exactly how I was brought up culturally, and I know exactly what to do. That's not what I want you to give me. What I want you to give me is what you can offer outside my cultural context, outside my upbringing, so that I can actually have a combination of my heritage and what my mom told me and the kitchen logic, which works so well, and the technology which you can give me, and I can actually get better." That was such a revealing thing. And, I had a Hispanic boss at that time. I said, "Listen, I can't believe what I heard. You're trying to give somebody something that she already has, and she understands that even better than us. What she's asking from you is to help her get to what you are offering and then help her to combine with her existing regimen." So that was a massive opener. And I still remember that was a mother-daughter in LA, and we went to the house, and they were looking at us so incredulously. The guys, "Why do you want to give me what I already have? Why don't you tell me what you can give me?" So this was like one of my, and this was around, David, around 15 years ago, 12, 13 years ago. But that shows you the power of talking to consumers and starting looking at insights and looking at how do you delight them.
I really love that. It reminds me of looking at commercials where that the kernel of insight is at the center. Like they unearthed something so powerful that sure follows a good execution, but the execution is so powerful because it was grounded on an incredibly powerful insight that was discovered through the process, which is exactly, I'm Hispanic, so I understand exactly what you're saying, and it's really powerful. We will talk in a little bit about synthetic audiences, and I think that's the question: is could you ever get to something as powerful as the story that you just shared, through a synthetic lens? We'll get there, but thank you for sharing. That was a incredibly insightful example. Um, you have managed brands that are deeply personal. You talked about beauty, but shaving, sun care, feminine
Yeah.
hygiene. How do companies use analytics, Pankaj, to distinguish between what may be a passing trend to a fundamental cultural shift in how people view self care?
It's a great question, David. And I think many times, really, we get it right. Many times you get it wrong. So to me, a trend is something which kind of comes and goes. It impacts a few people, and there is more talk versus adoption. So you talk, there's more discussion on the trend versus real behavior change, and it comes and goes. So uh, absolutely right. We need to kind of leverage trends, and I'll talk about it. To me, a cultural shift is more fundamental, which is, first of all, it kind of cuts across cultures and geographies and segments, and it actually changes behavior. So I'll give you two examples which come to my mind. So when I was working on oral care, we had this whole thing on charcoal toothpaste, and everybody wanted charcoal toothpaste. It was a trend, right? There were a couple of them which were launched. Some of them did well. We made some money. People made money, which is totally fine. We have to go with the trend. But short-lived thing, I don't find charcoal toothpaste on the shelves anymore.
Did you know that then? I mean, at that time, right? Like it was unclear.
It was unclear. It was unclear. And so, David, you're hitting a really good point. If you miss a trend, you will lose some business. But if you misjudge a trend to be a cultural shift and then start rewiring your entire ecosystem around that trend, you have a bigger problem, right? I'm not saying you should miss a
Yeah.
trend, but not understanding and wrongly classifying a trend as a cultural shift becomes a big problem, right? So the best thing is, and I'll give you some examples. For example, matcha, right? Matcha, I feel, is a trend, right? We see matcha. You go to New York City, every other store has
Yeah.
matcha. It has a lot of health benefits. There's no doubt about it. So the trend, I feel, is matcha. It feels like a trend, but it is deeply linked to a health benefit. So that's what we need to notice. So if matcha continues and the linkage with the health benefit on antioxidation and everything kind of becomes solidified, and then people start drinking matcha because they feel it's healthier, that starts becoming a cultural shift. So as marketeers, and this is where data comes in, we have to be very, very mindful that something which starts as a trend and seems like a trend, is it waning away or is it getting actually embedded as a cultural shift? And if matcha actually becomes the next elixir, right? And this is where you need to have, I love matcha. I drink it every day because I truly believe in the benefits. But if matcha is really something which you feel is going to really change behavior, then it becomes a wellness benefit. And that's a cultural shift. And I can say, then that basically says, then we start using predictive analytics and say, guys, what is the penetration of matcha in some form in the next 10 years? And then if that's going to change, how do we be ready for that next matcha revolution, which is the cultural shift? So it's a tricky one, but that's where, early signals and understanding how consumers are interacting with that trend is very critical.
I mean, that's great. The other side of that is, if health and wellness is what's driving the matcha trend, then there are also other opportunities beyond matcha that support that bigger cultural shift. The other one that comes to mind, obviously, with all of our food companies, is protein. I mean, now it's like, it's in the pillow.
Yes. Yes.
And the question is, like, what happened? What in what drove it? And what was the thing that began to, right? And anyways, but it's fascinating. So, I'm glad that it took us about 22 minutes to begin the AI conversation. We didn't start there. We have seen research suggesting that while consumers find AI helpful, and gosh, every day I think the path to purchase, I think, maybe is more prominent
Yeah.
with the interactions of LLMs. They still cross verify recommendations on either Reddit, like, or obviously friends. How are you using AI to enhance that rather than replace that human trust and emotional resonance?
So there are two things. I think there are two things happening simultaneously. One is, if you're solely focusing on an agent which is very data sparse or is built on public data only, then the level of confidence on that could be very, very minimal. And, we can talk about AI, and that's when you find people that, hey, I see something from an LLM, but it doesn't pass the red face test. Can I check with certain other kind of, Reddit or Twitter, or talk to friends or whatever, right? So one option there is, what we're trying to do is, how do we make sure that your agent has a lot of robust data streams? Something we spoke earlier as well, right? So how do we make sure that it comes with enough data streams and a semantic layer, which really helps us to come up with the right insight? Now, as consumers and users, they start using it, and they feel confident, and it goes through the gut, they feel more confident. So that is one part of it. The second part of it is that I think there's nothing wrong using an alternative source, and that's where supervised learning comes in, right? If you feel that your agent or your model or your LLM is not really giving you something which makes sense, and you go to an alternative source and you check it and there's a contradiction, then the whole thing of the human in the loop comes in, and where you say, hey guys, you go back and train your engine and say, hey, uh, if your LLM is saying, going back to a previous example, matcha is not good, and you have enough proof it is good, you maybe feed it some research studies and train the engine to say, hey, principally what we believe is that matcha is good. And then as you kind of do unsupervised learning through the engine, that gets integrated. So I think it's a good thing. One is let's plan to build something which doesn't have this dichotomy, but let's also keep, enhancing our engine as a part of this whole AI journey.
That's that's great. You know, as a cultural intelligence company sitting on enormous proprietary data, that is our perspective. That the nuance becomes even more valuable because of what the machine can do if fed the right depth and the right cultural nuance. Let's talk about synthetic for a second. You know, it's been very interesting. I've been doing these podcasts for, I don't know, a year and a half or 2 years, and I have seen a massive shift in acceptance, at least to experiment, with synthetic. When I began, or even a year ago, the reaction was, no, no, no. Like, we're all about deeply understanding consumers. There's no way that the machine can give us that. What, and that's shifted. Where are you on it, Pankaj?
See, we're all experimenting. And I talk to my peers, obviously, and we talk about synthetic. And synthetic, we've been working on synthetic for the last 2.5, 3 years. Synthetic is helpful in some use cases like forecasting, where you want to enhance your predictive modeling, where you want to kind of refine your scenarios based on robust statistical data. So that's where synthetic becomes helpful because it gives you the granularity. It helps you to kind of peel the onion a little bit and helps you to make the tool a little more robust. Synthetic becomes a bigger challenge when you have a lot of more interpretation that is needed for the data. So, for example, if you say, Pankaj, can we start using synthetic data for consumer trends? I would start getting very worried because you know how it works. Like synthetic data is eventually generated. It's synthetic for a reason. That's what it is, right? I would not personally at this stage, and I haven't seen any successful use case where synthetic data has worked in a little more ambiguous environment. So, and even when I talk about volume forecasting, you need synthetic data and parallel path your current predictive models so that your quality of synthetic data improves as you train that data generation. And then once you feel that, hey, your deltas and your errors are minimized or zero or almost zero, then go on synthetic data. But the challenge, David, is that, it's nice to talk about synthetic data, right? But if you make a business blunder because your synthetic data is not giving you the right signal, it could cost you millions of dollars. So as a responsible AI leader, I would be very careful on synthetic data. Experimentation is great. I love it. It's a lot of fun. But I would rely only on synthetic data when I have proof for a fairly long time that it gives me the right insights and is leading me in the right direction. So we are in a journey.
So, it's interesting in the research technology, in the rest tech arena, smart money is pouring millions and millions of dollars in synthetic players. Are you with one of those crazy valuations that, are you a contrarian in this? Like, do you think that those pan out over the long run?
See, synthetic data eventually will pan out. There's no doubt. It's just that so that it'll pan out for a few reasons. As I said, if it is initially use case specific, there's certain domains where synthetic data is more relevant. pan out for companies who are able to use proprietary synthetic data and integrate it in the system. But I'm not sure that in the next so long term, probably after 50 years, it'll all pan out, right? But if you're talking 3 years, I'm not sure 90% of the synthetic data providers will be able to drive value, because as practitioners, we still haven't seen the proof in the pudding to the extent where we can say, hey guys, we're all in. We are not all in there. We are still working on it. So if you have a 3-year horizon and if you're invested heavily in these stocks, David, I would not bet my life on it. If you have a 50-year horizon, go with it.
That is great. It's an important topic in our space. What about the role of AI in creative optimization from an advertising standpoint?
It has a very strong role in creative optimization, right? I think the word optimization is critical. So if you have the right consumer insight, if you're trying to bring to life the exact need gap or exact proposition which the consumer is looking for, and if there is a need and a desire for what you're offering, and if you're able to communicate in a way which the consumer rings with, that's the starting point. Now, once you have that in today's environment, you have so many creative executions, right? You have different channels, then you have a bumper, you have a 3 second, 5 second, 10 seconds. That's where I feel AI is very powerful, because once the guardrails have been set up and the foundation of your creative strategy and your comms are there, then picking up the most impactful points in your comms and modifying it a little bit is very impactful. In fact, you can even go a step further. You can have hundreds and hundreds of creative options. You can also have an engine which can validate them in real time and say, hey, and that's a great use case for AI, because then you can validate a few good ones. You can plow back the learnings, which is where AI comes in, and then you can say every other iteration and optimization, which is a critical word here, is in line with the learning which the engine has learned over a period of time. So I think it's a great thing. A lot of companies and some of the companies I've worked in, we're using it very effectively. And but that does not replace deep consumer insight and the whole area of connecting with consumers. The empathy, that doesn't replace that. But for optimization, absolutely.
I'm getting a very clear philosophical point of view from you. It's coming clearly, and I think it's to be taken very seriously, because at the end of the day, I mean, that's where it's at, the deep consumer understanding. So Pankaj, let's go a little personal for our last couple of minutes, which is what what inspires you, what motivates you to do what you do every day?
I want to get better. I want to do something different which impacts the business in a better way, faster, quicker, better, higher ROI, scrappier. So, and David, that's what led me into this whole area of analytics, because what I realized is that, early on in my journey, that I saw some excellent marketeers, and I started in marketing, right? Excellent marketeers are using some very poor data to make decisions. And then there's some excellent data which is lying around, which nobody uses. And there's a gap. And for a very long time, I've tried to see, hey, how can we kind of close this gap from data and analytics into insights and consumer comms, right? How do you really bring that to life? So that kind of started my journey into this whole exciting field of, there was no AI at that time, right? We still used to do a little bit of machine learning, right? And I found that the advent of technology and with everything which is happening around us, which I'm not going to repeat because we all know what's happening, you can actually re-engineer yourself and your organization almost every month, every year, and get better. And that what, wakes me up in the morning, helps me to come, enables me to come to work because I really want to change. I like changing things for the better. And if you see my history of my career, I started in marketing, went into insights, then got into analytics, then got into machine learning, AI. I started teaching AI. So I just love, driving new thinking and transformation in organizations which impact the business and which provide clear return on investment.
It's fantastic. I mean, so beautifully said, and it aligns so nicely with what's happening in our world. It almost seemed like you knew exactly where things were going, and you positioned yourself exactly for this moment. And but innovation seems the theme. Innovation, broadly defined. In the last question of the episode, which is geared towards our younger audience, but I think in many ways is in need of so much wisdom, career wisdom. If you, and I love this question, if you could travel back in time and give your 20-year-old self advice, what would that be?
See, I grew up as I my undergrad degree was in engineering, and then even after an MBA, I was very data focused. I have been very data focused. Uh, I think somewhere in mid career, I realized that storytelling is at the heart of everything we do. And honestly, I don't think I was a good storyteller early career, right? And I said, I am great in math, I'm an engineer. And I came into marketing. I can read data like nobody else. And that's my superpower. I think over the years, I realized that that's talking to yourself, right? It doesn't matter what you know. What's very critical is that how do you bring that, simplify it, communicate it, influence, and then make sure you drive change. So then I started focusing my thinking on how do you tell a story versus how nice a model you can create. So I teach at Rutgers, and I tell my students that, guys, end of the day, my first class in that is give me an elevator pitch of whom you are for 30 seconds. So very early on, if once you get into high school, I think we should teach our younger selves, our kids, to tell stories. Because see, this AI is all going to get democratized. I can tell you, David, my prediction is in 3 to 5 years, buying an agent or getting the LLM will be done by procurement because it'll all be there, right? It's exactly what happened to technology. Where we come in is how can you really, really tell the right story? So I would ask all young people to do all the good stuff, critical thinking, logical thinking, storytelling, engaging, all the soft skills, which we sometimes, especially as data and analytics professionals, certainly as tech people, we basically either ignore and sometimes we don't even want to go there. That is going to be the future.
Gosh, I love that. I mean, what a you have shared gold. I'll tell you this 15-second story before we end, which is when my kids were young. At some point, they said, we want to have a lemonade stand, like many do, and I got so excited because, as you know, there's so much that you can teach about business. So anyway, I said, wait, let me build this model and help you understand all of. So I took time, I built the whole model, and when I finally shared the model, you know what the answer back was? We don't want to do a lemonade stand anymore. So, anyways, the point is stories and storytelling. I couldn't agree with you more. It is. I mean, it's such a fantastic piece of advice and such a great way of ending our episode together. So, Pankaj, so grateful to you. Thank you for sharing of your incredible journey, your perspectives that I know will be very useful to the industry at large.
David, thank you so much. Really enjoyed, and I think uh, thank you for your time, and mm, we'll talk more.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. And thank you, everybody. This was another exciting episode of Cultural Fluency Makers. See you next time. That's a wrap on another episode of Cultural Fluency Makers. Thank you for joining us. Please share your comments and what you would like to hear more about. Be as specific as possible. For show notes and more, please visit culturalfluencymakers.com. This show is proudly sponsored by Collage Group, unleashing the power of cultural intelligence to fuel brand growth. Please follow Collage Group on LinkedIn, and we will see you next week.